Let's worship together and sing, Let My Words Be Few.
You are God in heaven, and here am I on earth. So I'll let my words be few. Jesus, I am so in love with you. And I'll stand in awe of you. Yes, I'll stand in awe of you. And I'll let my words be few. Jesus, I am so in love with you. The simplest of all love songs I want to bring to you. So I'll let my words be few. Jesus, I am so in love with you. And I'll stand in awe of you. Yes, I'll stand in awe of you. And I'll let my words be few. Jesus, I am so in love with you. And I'll stand in awe of you. Yes, I'll stand in awe of you. And I'll let my words be few. Jesus, I am so in love with you. Jesus, I am so in love with you.
I remember some time back seeing an ad in a single section of a local newspaper, and it went like this. SBF, single black female, seeks male companionship. Age and ethnicity, unimportant. I'm a young, slim, good-looking girl who loves to play. I love long walks in the woods, riding in your pickup truck, hunting, camping, fishing trips. I love cozying with your night spent lying by the fire. I'll be at the front door when you get home from work, wearing only what nature gave me. Stroke me, and I'm yours. Call, and there was a telephone number, and ask for Daisy. Now, before you start thinking, what in the world is LeBate talking about, something so risque and a message like this, I want to assure you that it's all okay. Here's why. The phone number was the local humane society, and Daisy was an adorable 12-week-old black Labrador Retriever puppy. The Humane Society said that they received 643 phone calls in 2 days with tongues hanging out of their mouth. 643 men called up, had visions of something that their dreams were made of, but when they dialed the number, they didn't get what they were expecting. Now, while this may be a very creative way of finding a home for a 12-week-old Labrador Retriever puppy, what happens when you have visions of God answering your prayers in a particular way, and when you call Him up through prayer, you don't get the response that you were expecting? For many Christians, the fact that God does not answer their prayers in the way that they think He should has been a difficult obstacle to overcome in their relationship with Him. You may even hear something like this from time to time. I asked God several years ago to heal my mom, but she died anyway. From that moment on, I decided I wanted nothing more to do with God. Now, there's other versions of that statement, all of which say that when God didn't answer the prayers in the fashion that they thought He should, signaled the end of their belief and trust in God. Let me ask you this question. What do you do when that happens? What do you hang on to when you go to God in prayer, something that you need Him to do, something that you just believe if He would do, would take care of things, wanting to claim the promises that He's making to you? What do you do when it doesn't work out the way you envision? Well, in that case, I ask you to remember these 3 words. In His time. Actually, this phrase comes from the book of Ecclesiastes, where it says God makes all things beautiful in His time. Not in ours, but in His time. You see, we don't have the ability to discern things the way God does. We don't have the wisdom to perceive all circumstances and all the nuances of those circumstances to know exactly what is the right thing to have happen in this case. Now, where do I get this? Well, over in the book of 1 Corinthians, there is a verse, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 9, that we have often applied to what's awaiting for us in heaven. But that's not the only way we can apply this verse. Here's the words I'm talking about. That's why the scriptures say in 1 Corinthians 2, 9, the eyes of man can't see, his ears can't hear, and his mind can't imagine what God has in mind to do for those who love Him. You see, what that verse is telling us is that we really don't have the ability to understand how God is leading, what He's doing that we think is maybe not right or the best. That when God seems strangely silent in answer to our prayers, that we adopt the same attitude that we had as parents when we had kids growing up. What do I mean? I think you'll understand. When I was growing up, my best friend, his name was Glenn, and many afternoons Glenn and I would be up in his bedroom just, horsing around, making noise, sounding like the roof was caving in. And as long as we were doing that, his parents were fine. They just figured that's normal. But as soon as we got quiet, his mom or his dad would go to the foot of the stairs, call up and say, "What are you boys doing up there?" Now, isn't that interesting? It's when we got quiet that they thought we were up to something. Well, may I suggest to you that we adopt the same attitude and response when it comes to God. That when God gets quiet, we don't think He's checked out, that He's not listening, that He doesn't care, but rather that He must be up to something. He's working out something on our behalf that we don't know yet, that we don't understand, that we can't see. We have no idea what God is preparing for those who love Him, according to 1 Corinthians 2, verse 9. Let me give you another example. When I was attending college many years ago, my sophomore year, 1978, I had a friend just down the hall. His name was Frank. And one day Frank was telling me about this girl that he met. He said she's pretty, She's smart. She's kind. She's patient. She's polite. She sounded like the total package. And he said, Rick, I just think if I could, we've had a date or two, and I'm just really liking the vibes that I'm getting from her. I would love to be able to have things work out where we keep dating and eventually get engaged and eventually get married. So would you pray with me that this is what happens? I said, sure, Frank, be happy to. So I remember there, room 108, Morrison Hall. We got down on our knees and our prayer went something like this. Dear God, Frank has met a very special individual here, and he just feels like this is the person for him for life. And we just pray that everything will work out so that they will eventually grow in their love for one another and get engaged and get married and have a happily ever after experience. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, I have to tell you that girl that we prayed for that night has been my wife for the last 39 years. Now, are you thinking, hey, LeBay, what are you doing? Did you jump in line ahead of Frank there? No, I actually didn't even meet her for several more months. And Frank did end up meeting somebody else that was just right for him in every way. But here's my point. I can't help but thinking what God must have been thinking when we were saying that prayer. I could almost imagine him saying, hey, Jesus, come here. You got to hear this prayer. There we are, so sincere, down on our knees. Oh, God, please let it work out. And Frank and Ruth Ann will actually get married one day. Well, I can imagine him chuckling, thinking, they have no idea what they're talking about. So, yeah, we don't know things the way God does. We're not wise like him. We don't see things the way he sees them. Now, oftentimes when we go to God in prayer, it's in moments of crisis. It's in moments of, God, help me, do something. Why don't you step in and take control? Why don't you do something? Usually what we mean by that is, God, why don't you do something now? And oftentimes, we don't get that response right away. It reminds me of this obituary that I ran across in the Richmond Times-Dispatch newspaper down here in Richmond, Virginia area from November of 2014. This is a copy that I printed out that was online. John Barkis was his name, his obituary. And you could probably see that there's a little section there that is highlighted in yellow. This is what that highlighted section said. John was also a diehard, and this is when they were known as the Redskins fan. And, one of his final wishes was that the team members would be his pallbearers so they could let him down one last time. Well, I had to obviously chuckle to think that a guy can have such a humor even in the process of when he knows he's dying. But it does bring up the point. Do we feel like God is constantly letting us down? God, are you going to let me down one more time? Why don't things work out the way I think they should? What's happening here, God? Well, one thing that we have to realize is that we as humans are impatient. Our impatience is a badge of our humanity. But now I want to give you a piece of information I hope was worth tuning in for, and that is this. A moment ago, we looked at 1 Corinthians 2:9, and it began with the 5 words, that's why the scriptures say. Now, anytime we run across those words in the New Testament, it's quoting the Old Testament. That's why the scriptures say. Now, Paul, when he was quoting back in the Old Testament, he actually got a verse that was from the book of Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 64, verse 4 to be exact. And this is what Isaiah 64:4 says. Eye has not seen, ear has not heard, neither has it entered into the heart of man the things that God has prepared for them that wait on him. So you see what Paul did? He took that verse, he quoted it word for word, except for one word. He changed one word. He changed the word wait and substituted the word love for it. What Paul was really trying to tell us is that we can't really say we ultimately love God unless we are willing to wait on him, unless we're willing to trust him, unless we're willing to not freak out because everything just doesn't work out the way we think God should work things out on our timetable. I want to show you a picture here of something that also helped me learn this. This is back from 2010 when I decided to cross something off of my bucket list. I wanted to go skydiving. Now, I knew I could do a skydiving where I'm strapped to an instructor and I go along for the ride and all that, but I wanted to do it myself. I figured if you're going to go skydiving and be in charge of what's happening. Well, I found an airport halfway between Richmond and Williamsburg that allowed me to do this. But you also had to be trained for it. So I showed up early on a Sunday morning, and for the next 6 hours, I was trained on how to skydive by myself for the first time. And I remember in those 6 hours, I had to use, and let me say this delicately, I had to use the men's facilities 6 times. It was like my mind was saying, oh yeah, this is a great idea, but my bowels are going, are you crazy? What are you thinking? And but eventually, I was tested in 2 areas. The physical test, had to remember what to do when it came to standing in the doorway of the plane, how to fall out of the plane, how to position my body as I'm falling, and I also had to take a written test. I passed the physical test, and I passed the written test, all but 2 questions. I got 48 out of 50 correct. The 2 I got wrong, what do you do in the case of an emergency? Well, I just prayed that there wouldn't be an emergency because I didn't trust my memory to know what to do because I couldn't even get it right when I was sitting at a desk on the ground, let alone in a situation like that. But if you look at the picture, you will notice that on the right side of my helmet is something that looks like a walkie-talkie. It was as I was just getting on the plane, right before this picture was taken, that my instructor came up and put this contraption in the side of my helmet. And I turned to him and I said, well, what are you doing? He says, well, I'm putting this in your helmet. I said, what is it? He goes, well, it's a radio. I said, oh, good. That way, when I'm falling 14,000 feet at 120 miles an hour and I need to talk to you, we can communicate. And he said, no, Rick, that's not how it works. It's a one-way radio. I said, oh, you mean you don't get to hear me? I'll tell you how I'm doing. He says, Rick, you still don't get it. It's a one-way radio, and we talk to you. And this is what he said. Because when you're falling 14,000 feet at 120 miles an hour, and you're up there for the very first time, you have nothing to say to us. I went, what? What do you mean I have nothing to say to you? He said, Rick, your job in that moment is to listen. I never forgot that. And that was a life lesson that really helped me to understand, even in my relationship with God, that when it feels like I'm falling, when it feels like I'm in crisis mode, when I'm scared, when it seems like I don't know what to do, my job is not to go to God and say, God, this is what you need to do. Please hear my prayer. Make sure you do this. Make sure you do that. Work it all out. No, my job at that time is to listen to Him, to read His Word, to go in prayer, to be still and know that He is God. Well, moving on. If there was ever a person who deserved to have their prayers answered right away when they were in crisis mode, it was John the Baptist. Jesus said of John the Baptist these words, no greater man was born of woman than John the Baptist. I mean, think about that. No greater man born of woman. That's like saying, everybody. And that was also Jesus saying it. So at the top of the affirmation chart, that was in first place. And yet, when John the Baptist was taken prisoner and he was languishing in a lonely cell for doing God's will, Pastor Jesus didn't even come to visit him. It's like, what's that all about? Well, we actually get a little bit of an insight into this in the wonderful book on the life of Jesus called The Desire of Ages. And this is what it says. For the sake of thousands who in after years must pass from prison to death, John was to drink the cup of martyrdom. as the followers of Jesus should languish in lonely cells, or perish by the sword, the rack, or the faggot, apparently, please don't miss that word, apparently forsaken by God and man, what is stayed to their hearts would be the thought that John the Baptist, to whose faithfulness Christ himself had borne witness, had passed through a similar experience. Now, my response to that is, well, I can see that. That's kind of nice. That if I'm ever in that situation and I don't get my answer right away, I can look back and say, hey, even John the Baptist, as good as he was, he didn't get that. But what about John the Baptist? He didn't know that. He didn't know what was happening at the moment. Well, what would he have thought if he could somehow see things from God's perspective? Well, we actually get an insight into that. Just a little later on in the same chapter, we read these words. God never leads his children. Otherwise, then they would choose to be led if they could see the end from the beginning and discern the glory of the purpose which they are fulfilling as co-workers with him. And of all the gifts that heaven can bestow upon men, fellowship with Christ in his sufferings is the most weighty trust and the highest honor. So what that is telling us is that if we could see things the way God sees things, if we could see the end from the beginning, then we would say, God, don't change a thing. You're doing exactly what needs to happen. Thank you. But it's because we can't see that we sometimes get into this panic mode. But if we could simply learn to trust God and realize that he's got this, he's got us, then we would be just fine. We would have peace in moments like this. Well, I want to wrap up this message by sharing one of my favorite stories, a true story that I ran across quite a few years ago. Actually, it was in the Reader's Digest. Did a little more research on it, wanted to find the original source, and let me share this story with you. It's about a pastor, a young pastor, who was assigned to go to a church in downtown New York City. Now, this church once upon a time had been a thriving congregation. They had about 1,000 members. Things were happening. But now they were down to just simply a small handful of members. And so he was sent there to see what he could do. So he goes there, and he realizes that, this is not a good situation. This church is not only just gone from 1,000 to about 12 members, but the building itself is just falling apart. So he hatches a plan, and he thinks, maybe if I could relaunch this church somehow and restart it, that would be the way to get things going again. But he realized in order for that to happen, he was going to have to get to work on the church itself, the physical facility. So his plan was to have everything ready by a Christmas Eve service. And he would reach out to the former members who no longer attended. He would reach out to the community and have a relaunching on Christmas Eve. What a nice way to do that. Sounded like a good plan. So for the next few months, he rolled up his sleeves and started doing all kinds of work throughout the church. He painted, he sanded, he sawed, he put things together, he plastered, he did everything that he could see to do to get that church back in shape. Well, a few days before Christmas, it was ready to go. But that night, there was a heavy storm that moved through New York City. And so when the pastor got to the church the very next day, he looked at the front of the church, and he saw at the front of the church there was a hole in the wall, a large gaping hole, about 6 feet by 8 feet. And he thought, what's this? What happened? Well, as he investigated, he realized what had happened is that this storm had somehow, a lot of water had gotten under some loose shingles on the roof that he didn't know were loose up there, and it ran down the wall, and it soaked the plaster, and the plaster fell in. And he was livid that God allowed this to happen. He had been working for months. Everything was in place. He was doing God's work. Why did God allow something like this to happen? So he was furious. And so he decided to take a walk to calm down. And as he's walking the streets of New York, muttering to God under his breath, God, I don't understand you. Why did you allow this to happen? I'm trying to do your work. I'm trying to get this church started. On and on and on and on he went. And eventually he found himself in a building at the back of an auction. And there was a particular item that was going up for sale just as he got there. And it was a tablecloth. And you know how auctioneers talk, $2, however they do that. And pretty soon, he saw his hand go up in the air, and he was like, what's that? I don't want to bid on a tablecloth. It was like an automatic reflex that made his arm go up. And he was the winning bidder. So he walked up to the auctioneer and said, sir, I didn't mean to bid on that. And the auctioneer said, sir, I'm sorry, you bid, you pay. He said, okay. So he turned over $5 or whatever it was for the tablecloth, put the tablecloth under his arm and started walking back to the church, this time talking to himself. Why did I buy a tablecloth for? I don't need this tablecloth. Why did my arm go up in the air? Like, what's this all about? I don't want this. And he walks to the church and he sets the tablecloth down on the altar and begins to walk away. Well, he only gets a few steps away when all of a sudden something strikes him. He turns around, takes the tablecloth, picks it up, shakes it out, and kind of eyeballs it over the hole in the front of the church there and said, I wonder. So he sets the tablecloth down, goes out to the shed behind the church, gets the ladder, comes in, grabs the tablecloth, goes up the ladder, and the tablecloth covers the hole perfectly. Just a few inches extra on every side. So he tacks the tablecloth up there, folds the ladder, goes down, takes a look, and says, yeah, that works. And as he's going to put the ladder back into the shed, he hears a voice at the back of the church. Pastor? Yes? Who is it? And it was an elderly woman. She said, Pastor, I hope you don't mind. I just wanted to come to the church. I just bought some groceries and my bones were getting so cold. It's a frigid day out there and it's starting to snow. And I just wanted to come here and get warm for a few minutes. I hope that was okay. Pastor said, of course, ma'am. But then she said something else. She asked him a question. Pastor, where did you get that tablecloth? And he told her the story about how he just got it at an auction. And she goes, Pastor, I think that's my tablecloth. He goes, oh? She says, yeah. Do you mind if I take a little closer look? Pastor said, sure, go ahead. And she looked at the bottom right-hand corner, and there were her initials. She said, yes, Pastor, that's my tablecloth. And the pastor said, oh, man, well, listen, if you want it, you just take it. And he said, no, Pastor, that's quite all right. You see, I don't have a use for that tablecloth anymore. Besides, it looks so nice hanging up there. The pastor said, why don't you have a use for it anymore? She said, well, you see, I made that tablecloth many years ago. Me and my husband, our family, we were living in Holland at the time. And I made that tablecloth for when we would get together on holidays and have our special family meals. And then the Nazis came. And they pulled my husband and my children away. And I never saw them again. I have no idea if they're alive or dead or where they are. But you see, I don't have a family anymore, so I don't need that tablecloth. And the pastor said, well, ma'am, I'm sorry to hear that story. It's very, very sad. But thank you for letting me keep the tablecloth. She said, oh, sure. The pastor said, well, ma'am, because you're being so generous and letting me keep it, do you need a ride home to your apartment or house, whatever? She said, oh, Pastor, that would be so nice. It is starting to get very, very cold out there. He said, come on. So he took the elderly woman back to her apartment, left her, and then the Christmas Eve service, a couple of days later, began. It was a wonderful Christmas Eve service. Many people from the community came. Many of the former members came. And the pastor was just glowing in how well it was happening. And after the service was over, he was standing at the back of the church shaking the hands of the people who came. And he noticed that to the side of his vision was an elderly gentleman. And after he got done greeting the people, this elderly gentleman came up and said, "Pastor, can I ask you a question?" He said, "Sure." He said, "Where did you get that tablecloth?" "Oh, I think that's a tablecloth my wife made." And the pastor was thinking, this is the second time in 3 days I've heard this comment. And he said, "Well, why do you think that, sir?" And he told the pastor the story that back in the 1940s, they were living in Holland at the time, and the Nazis came and took him away and the children, and he was separated from his family and his wife, and he never saw her again, and he doesn't know, if she's dead or alive or where she might be. And the pastor said, "Sir, do you have a few moments where I could take you somewhere with me?" And the old man went, "Well, sure." So they got in the pastor's car, and the pastor drove him to the apartment where the woman was, knocked on the apartment door, stood to the side, the door opened, and he saw the reunion of this husband and wife that had been separated for about 40 years. Now, that's a pretty cool story, but we have to ask some questions in order to really drive the point home. What do I mean? Well, what about questions like these? What are the chances that the storm would come through at that church in just the direction it did, to drive the rain underneath the shingles, to wash out a big hole in the front of the church? What are the chances that the pastor would find himself at an auction bidding on a tablecloth that he didn't need or want? What are the chances that an elderly woman who had just gotten her groceries and wanted to warm herself up happened to walk into the church and sit down just while the pastor was putting up the tablecloth? What are the chances that that tablecloth would be the tablecloth that belonged to that woman? What are the chances that the elderly gentleman who was at the service a couple of nights later would happen to notice the tablecloth? And what are the chances of all these things happening that would bring this man and woman together again? Well, I think we'd have to say the chances would be zero. It was a divinely orchestrated plan on the part of God to reunite a husband and wife who had been living in the same city all these years, but just never could find one another. It was God making all things beautiful in His time. If you will indulge me just for another minute, I'd like to ask one final question. Do we see holes in the walls where if we only knew what God was doing, we would be singing praises instead? We take a look at a situation that we're facing. Excuse me. Some crisis that we're in. Something that isn't working out. Something that we have declared is a bad thing. We say, that is a hole in the wall. God, what are you going to do to fix the hole in the wall? But if we knew what God was doing wonderful on our behalf, that our eyes can't see, our ears can't hear, our minds can't imagine, the things that God is preparing for those who wait on Him, how much different and how much more peaceful we would be. Remember, God really does make all things beautiful in His time.